So this is going to be the final segment of today's event. Juan Williams, who's to my immediate right, is an author, a columnist, longtime political activist. He's also someone I consider a personal friend and a mentor. Juan is currently a senior political analyst at Fox News and a weekly columnist for The Hill. He's wrote for the Washington Post for more than 20 years, worked as a national correspondent for NPR, and received an Emmy Award for his television documentary writing. He's the author of several books, including Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary, and Muzzled, The Assault on Honest Debate, as well as Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, 1954 to 1965. He's currently writing a new book that will serve as a follow-up to Eyes on the Prize. There are few, if any, journalists in the country who can match Juan's depth and range of knowledge about the civil rights era. And I can't think of anyone better suited to interview Congressman Ritchie Torres about the issues we've been discussing today. So let's turn things over to Juan.
Jason, thank you. That was very kind. I appreciate it. Welcome. I bet you had an easier time getting here than I did. The Acela is a mess, I can tell you. But I am so honored to be with Congressman Ritchie Torres. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for...
Of course, no. Thank you for schlepping from D.C., so.
Oh, well, I tell you, I'm honored to be with you, and of course I would do anything for Jason. A recent New York Magazine article that was very critical of you had the picture of the wrong person with the article. And you said, hey, not all black people look alike. Well, you know, it prompted a thought on my part, Congressman. I said, what about Afro-Latino who grew up in New York City public housing? You see, because I'd be honored at my age if anyone confused my picture with you. You know what I mean? So now I want to, having broken the ice, this is the first time we've met, I wanted to begin by a discussion with you about the history of blacks and Jews and where we are today. I thought we might just begin with the news because you're a strong supporter of Israel, and right from the start of the terror on October 7th, you have been standing tall for Israel in the American Congress, but also in the civic debate about how people might view the events of the war. But at the moment, you're upset with the Israeli Prime Minister putting out a video that's been critical of President Biden for allegedly withholding weapons. People are wondering, is this a conflict for you? Where do you stand?
So I think of the U.S.-Israel relationship as a marriage. And in every marriage, you're going to have debate, disagreement, differences. And I feel like both sides, to the extent possible, should keep differences private. We have to understand that there are two wars unfolding. There's the kinetic war in Gaza, but there's also the information war unfolding on social media. And if either President Biden or Prime Minister Netanyahu signal that there is strain in the U.S.-Israel relationship, I worry that plays into the hands of Hamas, which has an interest in destabilizing that relationship. So my criticism was less about the substance and more about the practice of keeping these differences private to the extent possible.
Now,
because when President Biden announced on CNN that he was withholding weapons, I was one of the Democrats who was critical of him.
That's right.
I faulted him for airing the dirty laundry, and I will do the same to the other side if I'm consistent, if nothing else. So.
Well, I think people would applaud that. Now, this falls into a discussion here in the United States about black-Jewish relations. And it's intriguing. I was looking at some numbers today, and right at the start of this, what you saw was about 17% of whites said, oh, we're very much concerned about the plight of the Palestinians. About 27% of Latinos, but you had about 34% of African Americans.
Yeah.
That has actually now grown on all sides. There's more concern in general. But what do you see as going on? What's happening in your district in the South Bronx?
So I disagree with the narrative about Black-Jewish relations. For me, I see anti-Zionism as the latest mutation in the DNA of anti-Semitism. And for me, anti-Zionism is not so much a racial as it is a generational phenomenon. That young Americans of all races are increasingly skeptical and critical and outright hostile toward Israel. That the strongest predictors of anti-Zionism is not so much race, it's youth, it's educational attainment, particularly among the college-educated, and social media. If you, every month, I think the Harvard-Harris does a poll asking, do you side with Israel or Hamas in the present conflict? 80% of Americans side with Israel.
Right.
An alarming 20% side with Hamas. But when you break it down by age, among Generation Z, it's 50-50. And NBC did a separate poll. If you break it down by social media use, TikTok users are more anti-Israel by orders of magnitude. So I feel like we're misunderstanding the nature of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in America. And I would submit to you, the African-American vote in the Democratic Party is a moderating force. Were it not for African-Americans, Bernie Sanders rather than Joe Biden would have been the Democratic nominee.
And you backed Bernie Sanders.
No, I did not in 2000.
I meant before, 2016.
But not in 2020. Right. And were it not for the African-American vote, Bernie Sanders would have been the Democratic nominee. He would have been far more hostile to the U.S.-Israel relationship. If you look at a race like Ohio 11 between Shontel Brown versus Nina Turner, Shontel Brown's base was made up of Jews and African-Americans, whereas Nina Turner was mostly white progressives. And if you look at the membership of the Democratic Socialist of America, which is, I would argue, anti-Semitic, it was one of the organizations that celebrated October 7th on October 8th, there are few African Americans and Latinos in the ranks of the DSA. It's mostly white.
Right.
And if you look at New York City neighborhoods, whether it's Northeast Bronx, primarily Black, South Bronx, primarily Latino, Southeast Queens, primarily Black, ideas like BDS and anti-Zionism have no real currency there. Because if you're a single mother of color in the Bronx and you're struggling to put food on the table and pay the bills, the farthest thing on your mind is Israel or Palestine. Right? There's a sense in which anti-Zionism is a luxury belief among the college-educated.
It was interesting when you were talking about the generational divide, you said you can also see in terms of the educational divide.
The irony of our society is that the most academically educated people are the morally least educated people. When people ask me, Richie, why are you so pro-Israel? It's because I dropped out of college.
But at the same time,
think about the congressional hearing. No, think about the congressional hearing. If I asked the average person in the Bronx,
right,
who has no college education, is calling for a genocide of Jews harassment, my constituents say, of course it's harassment.
Right.
But if you ask an activist or an academic, then you get a coldly legalistic answer. It's context dependent. And so for me, the loss of moral common sense is not a bug, but a feature of what higher education has become.
Well, in thinking about the younger generation, though, you also said the people who are most wed to TikTok.
Yes.
And I don't know that those are the most highly educated. So it's kind of across the board, you think?
Look, Gen Z, which is the most anti-Israel generation in American history, is the first generation to grow up on social media. And what's new is not anti-Semitism. What's new is the algorithmic amplification of anti-Semitism on platforms like TikTok and Twitter. If you think of anti-Semitism as a virus, viruses have varying levels of lethality and transmissibility. Right? There have been moments in history when anti-Semitism has been more lethal, but never in human history has it been more transmissible than it is now because of social media.
Well, let's take a little bit of a deep dive into your role in Congress, beginning with, well...
I'm the Lieutenant Governor of New York State, I'm sorry.
Is that right? You changed on me?
I was mistaken for it was a futile attempt at a joke.
I appreciate it. But Congresswoman Cori Bush said Israel is guilty of war crimes. You said that is offensive.
It's a lie. It's a blood libel.
That's what you said. That's where I was
Blood
going.
libel. There's no question.
And you also
Israel has made mistakes.
Right.
But making mistakes in the fog of war is quite different from committing war crimes. There is no moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel. There's no moral equivalence between war crimes and accidents, between atrocities and tragedies. And when you blur the line between the two, as the media has been doing,
Yep.
you are politicizing international law, you're weaponizing international law, and in the end, you're ultimately destroying international law. And what we've seen in this present moment is not only the destruction of law, but also of language. The word genocide no longer carries the moral weight that it once commanded because it has been used so politically.
But it's not just Cori Bush. You split from the Progressive Caucus over this issue. What does that feel like internally? That decision-making, did you feel as if you were separating yourself out from other people of color in the Congress?
Well, the majority of the CHC and CBC have Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus have a pro-Israel voting record. Look, I think you're referencing the squad. Right?
Yes.
The squad represents a visible vocal minority within the Democratic caucus. My concern is not so much the Democratic Party as it is today, but what will it be 5 or 10 years from now, right? My basic concern is that organizations like the DSA could be to American politics what Jeremy Corbyn became to the Labour Party in British politics. And so I feel like the onus falls on pro-Israel Democrats like myself to resist the Jeremy Corbynization of American politics.
And even as people applaud, I think, well, what is the cost for you? Has there been a political price to pay?
Yes, obviously I get fewer invites. Look, there's no issue on which I face more hate, harassment, and death threats than on the subject of Israel. My mother's been the target of harassment. There were anti-Israel activists who said, "You're a genocide mother, you should have aborted your son." My office has been vandalized. It was vandalized on Christmas with red paint. And there were activists who left a note that said, "Jesus was a Palestinian refugee in the West Bank, and you are the moral equivalent of a Christ killer." So, look, I knew politics would be tough. But if someone had said, "Ritchie, you're going to be accused of enabling genocide and deicide," I would have said, that's not quite what I anticipated. But I'm reminded of the quote from Hyman Roth of Godfather 2, "This is the business I've chosen." So.
Right. It's kind of tough.
Yeah.
Other
than that, it's going well.
I was going to say, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln?
Yeah. January 6th was my third day on the job, so.
In terms of that conversation, the majority of the Black Caucus, as you point out, is pro-Israel.
Yeah.
But the conversation in terms of Black America is a bit more broad. The NAACP, for example, calling for a ceasefire, even as the Biden administration has said no. And you see overwhelming numbers of Americans thinking there should be a ceasefire. But in the Black community...
It depends on how you frame it. Like,
well, I know,
yes,
but
if you ask, should there be an end to the war, or should there be a ceasefire? Most people would say yes.
Right.
But should Hamas remain in power? Most people would say no.
Right.
Should there be a release of the hostages? Most people would say yes. So it depends on how you present the trade-offs, and most of the framing is dishonest.
Well, you can't say it's dishonest in terms of people, especially young people, and young progressives, saying they are quite disgruntled with the Biden administration, and that they would, consider not voting for him.
Why? Because Donald Trump's going to be more sympathetic to the Palestinians.
I pose the questions. You give the answers.
Look, I've never won the presidency, and I'm 36, so maybe 44 years from now I'll run for president. So I hope to have your vote in advance. But look, if there's a set of voters, because so much has been said about Michigan, right? Although people forget there are Jewish voters in Michigan, there are Jewish voters in Pennsylvania, which is a must-win swing state. But if there's a set of voters who believe that you're enabling the gravest crime against humanity, which is genocide, you're never going to win those voters. There's no point in placating the implacable, in reasoning with people who refuse to be reasoned with. You just have to do what you think is right, and then let the dice fall where they may. That's my view.
I think that's correct. There's a long history in terms of Black-Jewish relations in this country. It goes back so far. I was thinking as I got ready to talk with you today about people as far back as Du Bois, Marcus Garvey. It's unbelievable. Coming forward.
Brown versus Board of Education, AJC was part of that litigation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking in all of those terms. Then you move forward from that and you come to a moment where books are written like Broken Alliance and people are concerned that that common sense of destiny and partnership had eroded. Do you believe that it has fallen apart at this juncture?
Yeah, I feel like we have to stop resting on our laurels and stop. We all romanticize about the Black Jewish solidarity and the marching of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King. But look, we are here's what I see in my district. I represent the South Bronx, which is mostly African American and Latino, and Riverdale, which is heavily Jewish. And those two communities rarely interact. And it's not because there's mutual hatred. There's just simply no interaction. We are an intensely segregated society by race and class. And so I feel like proactive efforts have to be made to break down those barriers and to create mutual understanding and mutual respect. So one idea I have is I would love to bring, pick a school in the South Bronx and pick a school like SAR in Riverdale and bring the students to the African American Museum and the Holocaust Museum so that the Black students can learn more about anti-Semitism and the Jewish students can learn more about racism, and hopefully out of that shared experience comes mutual understanding and mutual respect. So I feel like initiatives like those could build bridges.
I'm thinking, though, that we were discussing earlier generational issues as kind of compounding racial divide, because demographically, Blacks, Latinos are a younger population. Yeah. And I was thinking about people like Louis Farrakhan, thinking about Jesse Jackson, who had some very strong anti-Semitic comments at one point, especially when he was running for president. Do you see that generation of Black leadership as having damaged the Black-Jewish relationship?
I feel like the anti-Semitism that we're seeing today is qualitatively different from what we've seen before, because it is, for me, the two disproportionate drivers are academia. Ideas like intersectionality originate from the academy, but it's social media that has enabled those ideas to permeate outward into the broader society and to polarize and radicalize our politics. So I feel like part of fighting anti-Semitism means reforming institutions that have been overtaken, have been corrupted from within, higher education and social media.
And when you talk about your district and the high level of segregation between Blacks and Jews,
yeah.
I mentioned that I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in Crown Heights. I literally grew up in a Black Jewish neighborhood. Lots of immigrants. Yeah. But now everything is so divided. And I'm thinking that part of that is, people have gone their own ways. And you see a higher level of upward mobility in the Jewish community than you do in the Black community. What weight would you put on the Jewish community in terms of repairing that rift?
Look, I think young people of all ages are going to be a challenge, but the Black community is a natural ally of the Jewish community. There should be more engagement with Black pastors. Invite them over to Shabbat. I went the first 27 years of my life without a Shabbat. And now I have one every Friday for the rest of my life. I can only share my experience. It's not based on polling, but I find that the people of the Bronx, who are mostly people of color, are pragmatic, not ideological, are moderate, not radical, and therefore are natural allies for the pro-Israel community, right? And that's been my experience. And if you look at who's being elected in these communities, right? I'm one of the most visible vocal defenders of Israel, and I come from one of the most majority-minority districts in America. Hakeem Jeffries comes from Central Brooklyn, heavily black. Eric Adams from Central Brooklyn, heavily black. Greg Meeks from Southeast Queens, heavily black. We're all strongly pro-Israel.
Well, then how does that play with the younger cohort of the squad that you felt necessary to separate yourself from?
Look, we need to reform social media, so I'm part of the China Committee, which we were the driving force behind a legislation that forced a divestment from TikTok, because our view is that TikTok is not merely a social media platform, it's the leading news source for the next generation of Americans. Americans are forming their opinions about Israel not based on firsthand experience, based on TikTok. And the fact that we as a society would put the leading news source for the most impressionable minds in the hands of our leading foreign adversary, the Chinese Communist Party, like that's an act of national self-sabotage. I mean, that would have been the equivalent of permitting a Soviet company to own ABC, NBC, and CBS, or own the Manhattan Institute during the peak of the Cold War. The last one was a joke, but I guess.
No, but you said this before, and it really struck me as true. I just can't believe it. I think it's corrupt what goes on with so much of that social media.
And TikTok is the worst, and it's not by accident, it's by design.
But Congress,
we're allowing our foreign adversaries to conduct foreign influence operations against us through our own institutions. Like, think about the influence of Qatar on higher education. Qatar invests billions of dollars in higher education. And Washington Monthly actually had a graph showing a correlation between affordability and anti-Semitism, that the more elite and expensive a college, the greater the likelihood of an encampment.
Wow.
In the Bronx, there are no encampments at Hostos Community College. There are no encampments at Bronx Community College. There's not even an encampment at the Jesuit school, Fordham University. Right? Anti-Zionism is the luxury belief of the Ivy Leagues.
One of the intriguing arguments here touches on academia, but it goes back to something I encountered when I was doing a biography of former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first African American on the bench. And in the course of arguments over affirmative action, you could see Marshall, who was a huge supporter and hugely supported by the Jewish community, come into conflict with the Jewish community over the idea of quotas. The quotas had been used against Jewish people for much of the history of this country, the United States. But he saw it not so much as a ceiling, as in the Jewish experience, but as a floor, something that would guarantee opportunity for blacks. Do you see that as promoting the black-Jewish divide?
I mean, possibly, although most Jews are liberal, are progressive. Many of them support affirmative action, so I'm not clear that that is a sufficient explanation. But look, there are going to be tensions between and among communities. I mean, this is one of the criticisms of Israel. People say, well, Arabs there are tensions with Arabs. I'm like, the only societies that have no racial tensions are the societies that have no racial diversity.
Yeah, true.
Like, there's no racial tensions in Japan because there's no racial diversity. There's only Japanese, right? It's countries like the United States and Israel that do the hard work of multiracial democracy that every so often have racial tensions. But I feel like we're progressing as a country.
I think that's right. The question is, where are we going? And especially now with this war. There's no way for you or for me to, be visionary about this, but politically, what do you think? As we, before when I asked you about President Biden's chances, you said, what are they going to do? What's the alternative? Is that what's next down the road?
I almost refuse to think about it politically because I cannot tell you. I suspect it's a losing issue no matter what happens. But if Hamas remains in power, Israel's at risk of an October 7th repeat.
Right.
Like, there will never be security for Israel. There will never be peace between Israelis and Palestinians as long as Hamas remains in power. Like, the removal of Hamas from power has to be seen as a non-negotiable.
But is it possible to eliminate an ideology?
I mean, have we eliminated the ideology of Nazism? But I think what matters is that we've eliminated the Nazi regime.
Right.
And you know, I think history has shown that peace is possible. You know, the greatest threats to democracy in the early 20th century were Japan and Germany, and now those two countries are among its greatest defenders. And we managed to achieve that without eliminating some of the underlying ideologies. I mean, for half of Israel's history, it was in an endless state of war with Egypt. And since 1979, there has been a peace agreement that has endured for 45 years. So I think history has shown that old hatreds can be overcome and that peace is possible.
Now, again, looking forward, I read where you're a supporter of a two-state solution, which is U.S. government policy.
Yeah.
But in the context of the presence of Hamas and the fact that Palestinians still overwhelmingly support Hamas, is that reasonable as an expectation, as a goal?
Well, so there's going to be no two-state solution in the short term.
Okay.
Right? But if you imagine a world where Hamas is removed from power and there's a de-radicalization of Palestinian civil society, and you have a regime that's able and willing to make peace with Israel and become part of the Abrahamic Accords, then those are conditions that could be conducive to the creation of a Palestinian state. But those are quite different from the realities on the ground at the moment. But there's never going to be a Palestinian sovereignty without a renunciation of violence, a renunciation of the right of return, and a recognition of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state.
Well, I think lots of Americans at this juncture are so concerned about the extent, the duration of this fighting.
Yeah.
Again, talking in future terms, how much longer?
I mean, no one wants war. But an end to the wretchedness of the war in Gaza requires the release of the hostages. Like, if Hamas were to release the hostages and surrender unconditionally, the war ends tomorrow. Like, Hamas has the power. Yeah. I find the media coverage frustrating because the international community has been pressuring Israel to enter into a ceasefire that keeps Hamas in power. But there's been far less pressure on Hamas to release the hostages. And so the international pressure, the media pressure, has been so overwhelmingly one-sided against Israel that Hamas feels emboldened to delay the release of the hostages and delay the end of the war. So Hamas is the single greatest stumbling block to the end of the war.
This is fascinating. I agree with you, but I must say that what you just pointed out about international opinion is so true. It's against Israel.
Yes.
And I thought the other day...
And we should be ashamed of ourselves as Americans. There are American hostages who are languishing in terror tunnels.
Indeed.
And most of us do not even know their names. You know, there have been movements that say their names. No one's saying the names of the American hostages in the Hamas terror tunnels. Why? Because they're Jewish. That's why.
The question becomes, I think, from the international perspective about the superior military might of Israel as compared to Hamas. Does that...
I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Hamas is a proxy for the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran is the most destabilizing force. You know, if you think about the axis of evil, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran is unique among them. Iran is the only country that has a network of proxies. Iran specializes in destabilizing countries from within, creating power vacuums, and then filling those power vacuums with terrorist organizations. Hezbollah is the most heavily armed terrorist organization in the world. It has 200,000 missiles squarely aimed at Israel. It has a few hundred or a few thousand precision-guided missiles that could target the critical infrastructure of a country the size of New Jersey, very small. And the threat of Hezbollah is so severe that it's displaced 60 to 100,000 Israelis from their own homes. Like, tens of thousands of Israelis have become exiles in their own land because of the threat from Hezbollah, which is ultimately a proxy for Iran. So to think about it purely as a conflict between Hamas and Israel is to miss the forest for the trees.
Well, I think it's becoming, again, forward-looking. Right now, the threat that Hezbollah poses to Israel on that northern border is now becoming explosive. I think it's becoming a flashpoint in the conflict. But again, from the international perspective, they say, well...
And the international community is to blame for it, because the international community pressured Israel to enter into a ceasefire that kept Hezbollah in power.
Well, the contrary perspective that I was going to get to with you was the death toll. In other words, 37,000, I think. How do you manage that concept, that you have a superior military on the ground against an inferior opponent?
Look, I feel, obviously my heart breaks for every loss of life, but it has to be understood that Gaza is a hellscape of terror tunnels and booby trap buildings and combatants camouflaged as civilians. We all know that Hamas hides behind civilians as human shields. We all know that Hamas hides military assets in schools and hospitals and houses of worship. And so the ultimate cause of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is not Israel, it is Hamas. It is Hamas's unprecedented militarization of its own civilian population and its own civilian infrastructure. So the outrage should be directed where it belongs, toward Hamas.
And I would say in recent days, Hamas has turned down a peace deal.
Look, there's a ceasefire on the table. Israel has accepted. Qatar, Egypt, the United States has accepted. The only country that repeatedly rejects it is Hamas.
Well, I think
But you don't see the ceasefire caucus pressuring Hamas.
Well, do you think that's going to shift now?
No. Because they don't want the war to end to Israel's benefit. They want the war to end to Israel's detriment. There's a faction in American politics that wants to see the world's only Jewish state wiped from the map.
Who's that?
I think we know who they are. I think if you're an elected official who's calling for the violent destruction of Israel as a Jewish state, and that's falsely accusing Israel of genocide.
So it's kind of the progressive far left.
I'm not saying every progressive, but the far left is vehemently anti-Zionist.
It's so troubling to me because I grew up at a time when, in the black church, the whole notion of, Dr. King talking about a promised land, or the whole idea of Moses and set my people free, there's a real bond. There's a real biblical connection there for me as a black child growing up. And it's just strange to me that people don't relate to that story as common ground for blacks and Jews.
Well, for young people, as you know, there's declining religiosity in America.
True.
And there's a sense in which politics has become religiosity without religion. Politics is the new religion of Gen Z. That's what it seems to me.
What do you mean?
The modus operandi. I have colleagues both on the far left and the far right who seem to think they alone possess the truth, and anyone who disagrees with them, including myself, is not merely wrong but evil, and we should be burned at the stake for heresy. We should be excommunicated. And I feel like that kind of fundamentalism has radicalized and polarized our politics.
And it's of a religious nature in your mind?
It's like religiosity without religion is how I would describe it. Yeah.
Well, let me stop there and ask do I have time to have the audience ask a few questions? What'd you say? Oh, one. Okay. You want to pick or shall I pick?
Oh, no, you should pick. I don't
All right. Go right ahead.
Unless it's a constituent, I don't want to.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Throughout the afternoon into this current panel, references have been made to messaging and media, social media. I'd like to hear what each of you has to say about what we can do to reform the mainstream media in this country, to get the facts out, to educate our population. We need educated citizens in a constitutional republic.
Do you want to go first?
I don't know. I feel like one of the corrosive trends in our society has been the substitution of activism for professionalism. You know, there are people who view themselves as activists in what should be objective enterprises, right? You know, so much of what we see in the media is anti-Israel activism masquerading as journalism. And so I feel like we have to be selective about who we hire as journalists, who we hire as scientists in every field. There needs to be a commitment to pursuing the truth, to pursuing objectivity. But if you view it as proper to use your platform as a journalist to impose your ideology of how the world should be, that to me is a betrayal of the journalistic enterprise, which should strive for truth and objectivity.
You know, I was
So
earlier.
I think we need to hire people who believe in that.
Earlier, though, I was going to picking up on the question, ask you about why Congress can't come to terms with regulation for some of the social media. We were talking about TikTok a moment ago. There was a vote on TikTok in the House, but it sits there in the Senate. And if you ask...
No, it passed.
I don't think it's the law.
It's the law.
I mean, it has not been acted upon. Let me put it to you that way.
Well, because there's a timeline in the law.
Right. And I think TikTok has a lot of people who are supporting it and trying to stop it. But if you then, maybe I should put it in terms of Instagram or Facebook.
Broader social media, right?
Yeah. I just don't see the regulation that I think most people in this audience would say, this is toxic, damaging content.
Look, I feel like we are as close as we've ever been to reforming social media. There's heightened awareness of social media as a catastrophe for the mental health of the next generation. The awareness has only intensified in the wake of October 7th. Like, you know, I'm not clear that we would have enacted a forced divestment of TikTok without October 7th. And so I'm actually more optimistic. I mean, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation,
Right.
is sounding the alarm about the mental health impact of social media. I predict that in the years to come, there will be a reform of social media platforms.
I predict that in years to come, this young man is going places. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you. Good to meet you. Thank you.